Athletic Club, Squad 2025-26 season. Athletic Club, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at San Mamés Stadium. The total market value of the team is €369 million. The manager is Ernesto Valverde. Unai Simon, Spanish goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €28 million. Alex Padilla, Mexican goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €3 million. Andoni Garozabel, Spanish defender. 29 years old, valued at €5 million. Dani Vivian, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €40 million. Aitor Paredes, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €22 million. Yere Alvarez, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Jesus Arreso, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €12 million. Aymeric Laporte, Spanish defender. 31 years old, valued at €10 million. Iñigo Lecue, Spanish defender. 32 years old, valued at €2 million. Yuri Berchiche, Spanish defender. 35 years old, valued at €2 million. Adama Boiro, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Mikel Viscar, Spanish midfielder. 32 years old, valued at €2 million. Oihan Sansit, Spanish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €60 million. Ruiz de Galarreta, Spanish midfielder. 32 years old, valued at €3 million. Mikel Jauregizar, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €30 million. Unai Gomez, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €6 million. Bennett Prados, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Alejandro Rego, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €2 million. Alex Berenguer, Spanish forward. 30 years old, valued at €9 million. Inaki Williams, Ghanaian forward. 31 years old, valued at €15 million. Nico Williams, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €70 million. Gorka Guruzeta, Spanish forward. 29 years old, valued at €6 million. Marone Sanadi, Moroccan forward. 24 years old, valued at €10 million. Nico Serrano, Spanish forward. 22 years old, valued at €1 million. Robert Navarro, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €6 million. Urko Izeta, Spanish forward. 26 years old, valued at €2 million. That's it for today. Stay tuned for more football magic here on Football World Euphoria. See you next time. Atletico de Madrid, Squad 2025-26 season. Atletico de Madrid, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Metropolitano Stadium. The total market value of the team is €623 million. The manager is Diego Simeone. Juan Musso, Argentine goalkeeper. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Jan Oblak, Slovenian goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at €20 million. Jose Maria Gimenez, Uruguayan defender. 30 years old, valued at €15 million. Matteo Ruggeri, Italian defender. 23 years old, valued at €16 million. Marcos Llorente, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at €25 million. Clément Lenglet, French defender. 30 years old, valued at €8 million. Nahuel Molina, Argentine defender. 27 years old, valued at 20 million euros. David Hanko, Slovak defender. 27 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Marc Pubel, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at 16 million euros. Javi Galón, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Robin Lenormand, Spanish defender. 28 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Conor Gallagher, English midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Johnny Cardoso, American midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Koke, Spanish midfielder. 33 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Pablo Barrios, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at 55 million euros. Alex Baena, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 55 million euros. Thiago Almada, Argentine midfielder. 24 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Antoine Griezmann, French forward. 34 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Alexander Sørloth, Norwegian forward. 29 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Carlos Martin, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Julian Alvarez, Argentine forward. 25 years old, valued at 100 million euros. Giuliano Simeone, Argentine forward. 22 years old, valued at 35 million euros. Giacomo Raspadori, Italian forward. 25 years old, valued at 25 million euros. Nico Gonzalez, Argentine forward. 27 years old, valued at 24 million euros. Thanks for watching. Football World Euphoria. Feel the game, live the passion. CA Osasuna, Squad 2025-26 season. Osasuna, from Spain, competing in La Liga, they play at El Sadar Stadium. The total market value of the team is 89 million euros. The manager is Alessio Lischi. Sergio Herrera, Spanish goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Aitor Fernandez, Spanish goalkeeper. 34 years old, valued at 700,000 euros. Juan Cruz, Spanish defender. 33 years old, valued at 1.5 million euros. Jorge Herando, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at 3.5 million euros. Valentin Rosier, French defender. 29 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Enzo Boyomo, Cameroonian defender. 23 years old, valued at 20 million euros. Abel Bretones, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Alejandro Catina, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Lucas Toro, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at 3 million euros. John Monjayola, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 7 million euros. Iker Munoz, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Aimar Rose, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Iker Benito, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at 1.5 million euros. Raúl Garcia, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Kike Barja, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at 1.5 million euros. Ruben Garcia, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Moir Gomez, Spanish forward. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Ante Budimir, Croatian forward. 34 years old, valued at €5 million. Geraldo Becker, Surinamese forward. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Victor Munoz, Spanish forward. 22 years old, valued at €5 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Football World Euphoria for more exclusive football content from around the globe. Celta de Vigo, Squad 2025-26 season. Celta de Vigo, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Abanca Barridos Stadium. The total market value of the team is €141 million. The manager is Claudio Giraldez. Ivan Villa, Spanish goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €1 million. Ionut Radu, Romanian goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Marc Vidal, Spanish goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €300,000. Karl Starfelt, Swedish defender. 30 years old, valued at €6 million. Oscar Mingueza, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Joseph Adu, Ghanaian defender. 30 years old, valued at €1 million. Sergio Carrera, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €4 million. Manu Fernandes, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €2 million. Javi Rueda, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Marcos Alonso, Spanish defender. 34 years old, valued at €2 million. Mihajlo Ristic, Serbian defender. 29 years old, valued at €1 million. Carlos Dominguez, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €3 million. Joel Largo, Spanish defender. 21 years old, valued at €2 million. Javi Rodriguez, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Ile Moriba, Guinean midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €6 million. Fran Beltran, Spanish midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Damian Rodriguez, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €3 million. Miguel Román, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €1 million. Hugo Sotelo, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €12 million. Borja Iglesias, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at €3 million. Ferran Jutgla, Spanish forward. 26 years old, valued at €8 million. Iago Aspas, Spanish forward. 38 years old, valued at €2 million. Franco Cervi, Argentine forward. 31 years old, valued at €1 million. Brian Zaragoza, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €12 million. Pablo Duran, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €3 million. Williot Swedberg, Swedish forward. 21 years old, valued at €10 million. Hugo Alvarez, Spanish forward. 22 years old, valued at €10 million. Jones El Abdellaoui, Moroccan forward. 19 years old, valued at €4 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Deportivo Alaves, Squad 2025-26 season. Deportivo Alaves, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Mendizorroza Stadium. The total market value of the team is €70 million. The manager is Eduardo Cudit. Antonio Silveira, Spanish goalkeeper. 29 years old, valued at €6 million. Raúl Fernández, Spanish goalkeeper. 37 years old, valued at €200,000. Facundo Garcés, Argentine defender. 26 years old, valued at €1 million. Youssef Enriquez, Moroccan defender. 20 years old, valued at €3 million. John Pacheco, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €4 million. Nikola Maras, Serbian defender. 29 years old, valued at €1 million. Nahuel Tenaglia, Argentine defender. 29 years old, valued at €3 million. Johnny Otto, Spanish defender. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Moussa Diarra, Malian defender. 24 years old, valued at €2 million. Victor Parada, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €1 million. Denis Suarez, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €1 million. Ander Guevara, Spanish midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €4 million. Antonio Blanco, Spanish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €10 million. Carles Alenor, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €3 million. John Guridi, Spanish midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €3 million. Pablo Ibornez, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €3 million. Calabi, Brazilian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €2 million. Carlos Pretesoni, Uruguayan midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €1 million. Carlos Vicente, Spanish forward. 26 years old, valued at €10 million. Mariano Diaz, Dominican forward. 32 years old, valued at €1 million. Tony Martinez, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Lucas Boget, Argentine forward. 29 years old, valued at €5 million. Abder Rabak, Algerian forward. 27 years old, valued at €1 million. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and tell us who your man of the match was. See you next time. Elche CF, Squad 2025-26 season. Elche CF, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Manuel Martínez Valero Stadium. The total market value of the team is €80 million. The manager is Eder Sarabia. Matias de Turo, Argentine goalkeeper. 38 years old, valued at €200,000. Anarqui Peña, Spanish goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €8 million. Alejandro Iturbe, Spanish goalkeeper. 22 years old, valued at €2 million. Adria Pedrosa, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €4 million. Bambo Diaby, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €1 million. Pedro Bigas, Spanish defender. 35 years old, valued at €500,000. Alvaro Núñez, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €3 million. John Donald, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €800,000. Leo Petrot, French defender. 28 years old, valued at €900,000. David Offengruber, Austrian defender. 24 years old, valued at €7 million. Victor Chust, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €3 million. Hector Fort, Spanish defender. 19 years old, valued at €10 million. Federico Redondo, Argentine midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €5 million. Yago Santiago, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €800,000. Marc Aguado, Spanish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €2 million. Germán Valera, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €1 million. Aleix Febas, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €3 million. Martim Neto, Portuguese midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €5 million. Joson, Spanish midfielder. 35 years old, valued at €200,000. Grady Diangana, Congolese midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €4 million. Rodrigo Mendoza, Spanish midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €9 million. Adam Boaya, Moroccan midfielder. 20 years old, valued at €500,000. Andre Silva, Portuguese forward. 29 years old, valued at €3 million. Rafa Mir, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at €2 million. Alvaro Rodriguez, Uruguayan forward. 21 years old, valued at €4 million. Ali Houari, Moroccan forward. 20 years old, valued at €300,000. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. FC Barcelona, Squad 2025-26 season. FC Barcelona, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, the total market value of the team is €1,110 million. The manager is Hansi Flick. Marc-Andre ter Stegen, German goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €8 million. Joan Garcia, Spanish goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €25 million. Wojciech Szczęsny, Polish goalkeeper. 35 years old, valued at €1 million. Alejandro Balde, Spanish defender. 21 years old, valued at €60 million. Ronald Araujo, Uruguayan defender. 26 years old, valued at €35 million. Pau Cubarsí, Spanish defender. 18 years old, valued at €80 million. Andreas Christensen, Danish defender. 29 years old, valued at €12 million. Gerard Martin, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €12 million. Jules Koundé, French defender. 26 years old, valued at €65 million. Eric Garcia, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €25 million. Gavi, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €40 million. Pedri, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €140 million. Fermin Lopez, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €60 million. Marc Casado, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €30 million. Dani Olmo, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €60 million. Frenkie de Jong, Dutch midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €45 million. Marc Bernal, Spanish midfielder. 18 years old, valued at €10 million. Ferran Torres, Spanish forward. 25 years old, valued at €50 million. Robert Lewandowski, Polish forward. 37 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Lamine Yamal, Spanish forward, 18 years old, valued at 200 million euros. Rafinha, Brazilian forward, 28 years old, valued at 90 million euros. Marcus Rashford, English forward, 27 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Rooney Bardghji, Swedish forward, 19 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Getafe, Squad 2025-26 season. Getafe CF, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Coliseum Stadium. The total market value of the team is 68 million euros. The manager is Jose Bordalás. Juri Letacek, Czech goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at 2 million euros. David Soria, Spanish goalkeeper. 32 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Deconam Janae, Togolese defender. 33 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Abdul Abkar, Moroccan defender. 26 years old, valued at 7 million euros. Alan Nyom, Cameroonian defender. 37 years old, valued at 300,000 euros. Diego Rico, Spanish defender. 32 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Kiko Femenia, Spanish defender. 34 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Juan Iglesias, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Domingos Duarte, Portuguese defender. 30 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Da Vinci, Spanish defender. 17 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Ismail Bekocha, Moroccan defender. 20 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Yvonne Neu, Cameroonian midfielder. 28 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Luis Milla, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Mario Martin, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Mauro Arambari, Uruguayan midfielder. 30 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Javi Munoz, Spanish midfielder. 30 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Juanmi, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Borja Merrill, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Abu Kamara, English forward. 22 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Alex Sanchez, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Koba da Costa, Bissau Guinean forward. 23 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Adrian Lisso, Spanish forward. 20 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Girona, Squad 2025-26 season. Girona FC, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Montilivi Stadium. The total market value of the team is 155 million euros. The manager is Michel Dominik Livakovic, Croatian goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at 6 million euros. Paulo Gazzaniga, Argentine goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Krapivtsov, Ukrainian goalkeeper. 20 years old, valued at 500,000 euros. Juan Carlos, Spanish goalkeeper. 37 years old, valued at 100,000 euros. Hugo Rincon, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €2 million. Arnau Martinez, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €10 million. David Lopez, Spanish defender. 36 years old, valued at €1 million. Vitor Rice, Brazilian defender. 19 years old, valued at €30 million. Alejandro Frances, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Daley Blind, Dutch defender. 35 years old, valued at €2 million. Alex Marino, Spanish defender. 32 years old, valued at €4 million. Donny van der Beek, Dutch midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Thomas Lemar, French midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €3 million. Azzedine Ounahi, Moroccan midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €10 million. Axel Witsel, Belgian midfielder. 36 years old, valued at €1 million. John Solis, Colombian midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €3 million. Ivan Martin, Spanish midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €6 million. Joel Roca, Spanish forward. 20 years old, valued at €5 million. Christian Stuani, Uruguayan forward. 39 years old, valued at €1 million. Porto, Spanish forward. 33 years old, valued at €2 million. Abel Ruiz, Spanish forward. 25 years old, valued at €4 million. Yasser Asprilla, Colombian forward. 21 years old, valued at €15 million. Viktor Siginkov, Ukrainian forward. 27 years old, valued at €15 million. Vladislav Vanat, Ukrainian forward. 23 years old, valued at €15 million. Brian Gill, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €12 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Levante, Squad 2025-26 season. Levante, from Spain, competing in La Liga, they play at Ciutat de Valencia Stadium. The total market value of the team is €87 million. The manager is Calero. Pablo Campos, Spanish goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Matthew Ryan, Australian goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €2 million. Matias Merino, Argentine defender. 22 years old, valued at €3 million. Alan Maturo, Uruguayan defender. 21 years old, valued at €6 million. Adrian Dela, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €1 million. Unai Elgezabal, Spanish defender. 32 years old, valued at €1 million. Diego Pampin, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €1 million. Jorge Cabello, Spanish defender. 21 years old, valued at €1 million. Victor Garcia, Spanish defender. 28 years old, valued at €1 million. Jeremy Toljan, German defender. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Manu Sanchez, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €6 million. Ander Olasagasti, Spanish midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €2 million. Pablo Martinez, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Unai Vencedor, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €2 million. Kervin Arriaga, Honduran midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Oriol Rey, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Roger Brigue, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at €2 million. Ivan Romero, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €8 million. José Luis Morales, Spanish forward. 38 years old, valued at €500,000. Godwin Koyalapu, Central African forward. 25 years old, valued at €2.5 million. Iker Losada, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €1.5 million. Carlos Espy, Spanish forward. 20 years old, valued at €2 million. Carl Eta Ayong, Cameroonian forward. 22 years old, valued at €20 million. Carlos Alvarez, Spanish forward. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Rayo Vallecano, Squad 2025-26 season. Rayo Vallecano, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Estadio de Vallecas Stadium. The total market value of the team is €88 million. The manager is Íñigo Pérez. Dani Cárdenas, Spanish goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €2 million. Augusto Batalla, Argentine goalkeeper. 29 years old, valued at €6 million. Andrei Ratiu, Romanian defender. 27 years old, valued at €12 million. Pep Chavarria, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €8 million. Luis Felipe, Italian defender. 28 years old, valued at €5 million. Abdul Mumin, Ghanaian defender. 27 years old, valued at €5 million. Ivan Baliu, Albanian defender. 33 years old, valued at €1 million. Alfonso Espino, Uruguayan defender. 33 years old, valued at €1 million. Florian Lejeune, French defender. 34 years old, valued at €3 million. Nobel Mendy, Senegalese defender. 21 years old, valued at €4 million. Josua Vertrouwd, Dutch defender. 21 years old, valued at €1 million. Pedro Diaz, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €3 million. Pathé Ciss, Senegalese midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Oscar Trejo, Argentine midfielder. 37 years old, valued at €1 million. Randy Nteka, Angolan midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €1 million. Gerard Gumbau, Spanish midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Unai Lopez, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €2 million. Oscar Valentin, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Issy Palazon, Spanish forward. 30 years old, valued at €4 million. Alamal, Brazilian forward. 27 years old, valued at €4 million. Sergio Camelo, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €3 million. Alvaro Garcia, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at €2 million. Jorge de Frutos, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at €12 million. Fran Perez, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €3 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Espanyol, Squad 2025-26 season. RCD Espanyol, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at RCDE Stadium. The total market value of the team is €99 million. The manager is Manolo Gonzalez. Ángel Fortuno, Spanish goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €300,000. Marko Dimitrovic, Serbian goalkeeper. 33 years old, valued at €800,000. Ruben Sanchez, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €1 million. Fernando Calero, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at €1.5 million. Leandro Cabrera, Uruguayan defender. 34 years old, valued at €1 million. José Salinas, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €3 million. Miguel Rubio, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Carlos Romero, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €10 million. Omar El Hilali, Moroccan defender. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Clemens Riedel, German defender. 22 years old, valued at €4 million. Urco Gonzalez, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €5 million. Edu Exposito, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €4 million. Paul Lozano, Spanish midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Ramon Terets, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €4 million. Charles Pickle, Congolese midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Javi Hernandez, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €500,000. Javi Puado, Spanish forward. 27 years old, valued at €10 million. Roberto Fernandez, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €6 million. Perry Miller, Spanish forward. 33 years old, valued at €1 million. Luca Coleosho, Italian forward. 21 years old, valued at €6 million. Jora Carreras, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at €3 million. Kike Garcia, Spanish forward. 35 years old, valued at €1 million. Antonio Roca, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Tyrese Dolan, English forward. 23 years old, valued at €10 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Mallorca, Squad 2025-26 season. Mallorca, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Mallorca Sant Moix Stadium. The total market value of the team is €85 million. The manager is Jagaba Arrasate. Leo Román, Spanish goalkeeper. 25 years old, valued at €5 million. Lucas Bergström, Finnish goalkeeper. 23 years old, valued at €700,000. Ivan Cuellar, Spanish goalkeeper. 41 years old, valued at €100,000. Mateu Mori, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €2 million. Tony Lato, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Marash Kambula, Albanian defender. 25 years old, valued at €8 million. Antonio Rayo, Spanish defender. 34 years old, valued at €2 million. Johan Mojica, Colombian defender. 33 years old, valued at €2 million. Pablo Maffeo, Argentine defender. 28 years old, valued at €5 million. Martin Valjant, Slovakian defender. 29 years old, valued at €5 million. David Lopez, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €500,000. Omar Mascarell, Equatoguinean midfielder. 32 years old, valued at €1 million. Antonio Sanchez, Spanish midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €2 million. Manu Morlanes, Spanish midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €2 million. Sergi Darder, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €4 million. Samu Costa, Portuguese midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €15 million. Dani Rodriguez, Spanish midfielder. 37 years old, valued at €100,000. Pablo Torre, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €6 million. Vedat Muriqi, Kosovo forward. 31 years old, valued at €5 million. Abden Prats, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at €1 million. Takuma Asano, Japanese forward. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Jan Vigili, Spanish forward. 19 years old, valued at €10 million. Mateo Joseph, Spanish forward. 21 years old, valued at €4 million. Javi Labraze, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €800,000. Marc Domenech, Spanish forward. 18 years old, valued at €1 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Real Betis, Squad 2025-26 season. Real Betis, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at La Cartuja Stadium. The total market value of the team is €215 million. The manager is Manuel Pellegrini. Alvaro Val, Spanish goalkeeper. 28 years old, valued at €2 million. Adrian, Spanish goalkeeper. 38 years old, valued at €1 million. Pau Lopez, Spanish goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at €3 million. Hector Bellerin, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at €2 million. Diego Llorente, Spanish defender. 32 years old, valued at €5 million. Nathan, Brazilian defender. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Marc Bartra, Spanish defender. 34 years old, valued at €1 million. Ricardo Rodriguez, Swiss defender. 33 years old, valued at €2 million. Valentin Gomez, Argentine defender. 22 years old, valued at €10 million. Junior Firpo, Dominican defender. 29 years old, valued at €8 million. Ángel Ortiz, Spanish defender. 21 years old, valued at €3 million. Sergi Altamira, Spanish midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €20 million. Pablo Fornals, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €6 million. Sofiane Amrabat, Moroccan midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €12 million. Nelson Diosa, Colombian midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €10 million. Giovanni Lo Celso, Argentine midfielder. 29 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Marc Roca, Spanish midfielder, 28 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Isco, Spanish midfielder, 33 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Anthony, Brazilian forward, 25 years old, valued at 30 million euros. Jaime Orvilla, Argentine forward, 31 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Abder Ezelzouli, Moroccan forward, 23 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Cedric Bakambu, Congolese forward, 34 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Rodrigo Riquelme, Spanish forward, 25 years old, valued at 12 million euros. Cucho Hernandez, Colombian forward, 26 years old, valued at 18 million euros. Aitor Ruibal, Spanish forward, 29 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Pablo Garcia, Spanish forward, 19 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Real Madrid, squad 2025-26 season. Real Madrid, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Santiago Bernabéu Stadium. The total market value of the team is €1,400,000,000. The manager is Xabi Alonso. Thibaut Courtois, Belgian goalkeeper, 33 years old, valued at €20 million. Andriy Lunin, Ukrainian goalkeeper, 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Daniel Carvajal, Spanish defender, 33 years old, valued at €8 million. Eder Militao, Brazilian defender, 27 years old, valued at €30 million. David Alaba, Austrian defender, 33 years old, valued at €4 million. Trent Alexander-Arnold, English defender, 27 years old, valued at €75 million. Raúl Asensio, Spanish defender, 22 years old, valued at €30 million. Alvaro Carreras, Spanish defender, 22 years old, valued at €50 million. Fran Garcia, Spanish defender, 26 years old, valued at €18 million. Antonio Rudiger, German defender, 32 years old, valued at €15 million. Ferland Mendy, French defender, 30 years old, valued at €10 million. Dean Hewson, Spanish defender, 20 years old, valued at €70 million. Jude Bellingham, English midfielder, 22 years old, valued at €180 million. Eduardo Camavinga, French midfielder, 22 years old, valued at €50 million. Federico Valverde, Uruguayan midfielder, 27 years old, valued at €130 million. Aurélien Tchouameni, French midfielder, 25 years old, valued at €75 million. Arda Güler, Turkish midfielder, 20 years old, valued at €60 million. Dani Ceballos, Spanish midfielder, 29 years old, valued at €8 million. Vinicius Jr., Brazilian forward, 25 years old, valued at €150 million. Endrick, Brazilian forward, 19 years old, valued at €35 million. Kylian Mbappé, French forward, 26 years old, valued at €180 million. Rodrigo, Brazilian forward, 24 years old, valued at €80 million. Gonzalo Garcia, Spanish forward, 21 years old, valued at €15 million. Brahim Diaz, Moroccan forward, 26 years old, valued at 40 million euros. Franco Mastantuono, Argentine forward. 18 years old, valued at 50 million euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Real Oviedo, Squad 2025-26 season. Real Oviedo, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Carlos Tartiere Stadium. The total market value of the team is 60 million euros. The manager is Carrion. Horatia Moldovan, Romanian goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Aaron Escandel, Spanish goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Eric Bailly, Ivorian defender. 31 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Raheem Al-Hassan, Nigerian defender. 23 years old, valued at 2 million euros. David Costas, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Dani Calva, Spanish defender. 31 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Oya Luengo, Spanish defender. 27 years old, valued at 1 million euros. David Carmo, Angolan defender. 26 years old, valued at 10 million euros. Nacho Vidal, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Lucas Argiardo, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at 1 million euros. Javi Lopez, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at 8 million euros. Alberto Reina, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Kwasi Sibo, Ghanaian midfielder. 27 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Santi Cazorla, Spanish midfielder. 40 years old, valued at 200,000 euros. Santiago Colombato, Argentine midfielder. 28 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Brandon Dominguez, French midfielder. 25 years old, valued at 700,000 euros. Leander Dendoncker, Belgian midfielder. 30 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Luka Ilic, Serbian midfielder. 26 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Ilias Chera, Moroccan forward. 24 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Federico Vinas, Uruguayan forward. 27 years old, valued at 2 million euros. Haysam Hassan, French forward. 23 years old, valued at 5 million euros. Ovi Ajaria, English forward. 27 years old, valued at 300,000 euros. Josip Brekalo, Croatian forward. 27 years old, valued at 3 million euros. Alex Forés, Spanish forward. 24 years old, valued at 700,000 euros. Salomon Rondon, Venezuelan forward. 36 years old, valued at 500,000 euros. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Real Sociedad, Squad 2025-26 season. Real Sociedad, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Real Arena Stadium. The total market value of the team is 253 million euros. The manager is Sergio Francisco. Alex Ramiro, Spanish goalkeeper. 30 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Unai Marrero, Spanish goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at 600,000 euros. John Aramburu, Venezuelan defender. 23 years old, valued at 15 million euros. Ihan Munoz, Spanish defender. 28 years old, valued at 4 million euros. Igor Zubeldia, Spanish defender. 28 years old, valued at €9 million. Aritz Salustondo, Spanish defender. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Duje Kalita Kar, Croatian defender. 29 years old, valued at €4 million. Sergio Gomez, Spanish defender. 25 years old, valued at €15 million. Alvaro Odriozola, Spanish defender. 29 years old, valued at €1 million. John Martin, Spanish defender. 19 years old, valued at €5 million. John Gorachategui, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €6 million. Bennett Turrients, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €9 million. Yangel Herrera, Venezuelan midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €11 million. Carlos Sola, Spanish midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €12 million. Arsen Zakarian, Russian midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €7 million. Mikel Gotti, Spanish midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €1 million. Bray Mendes, Spanish midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €18 million. Luka Sucic, Croatian midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €12 million. Pablo Marin, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €8 million. Ander Barrenetxea, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €18 million. Ori Oskarsson, Icelandic forward. 21 years old, valued at €15 million. Mikel Oyarzabal, Spanish forward. 28 years old, valued at €20 million. Goncalo Guedes, Portuguese forward. 28 years old, valued at €8 million. Takefusa Kubo, Japanese forward. 24 years old, valued at €30 million. Umar Sadiq, Nigerian forward. 28 years old, valued at €5 million. John Karakaburu, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Sevilla, Squad 2025-26 season. Sevilla FC, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Ramon Sanchez Pizjuan Stadium. The total market value of the team is €127 million. The manager is Maicias Almeida. Vlachodimos, Greek goalkeeper, 31 years old, valued at €5 million. Orjan Nyland, Norwegian goalkeeper. 35 years old, valued at €1 million. Alvaro Fernandez, Spanish goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Jose Carmona, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €12 million. Cesar Azpilicueta, Spanish defender. 36 years old, valued at €2 million. Kike Salas, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €8 million. Tanguy Nianzo, French defender. 23 years old, valued at €2 million. Gabriel Suazo, Chilean defender. 28 years old, valued at €4 million. Fabio Cardoso, Portuguese defender. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Juanlu Sanchez, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €15 million. Ramon Martinez, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €1 million. Marçal, Brazilian defender. 29 years old, valued at €2 million. Andres Castrin, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €1 million. Nemanja Gude, Serbian midfielder. 33 years old, valued at €3 million. Joan Jordan, Spanish midfielder. 31 years old, valued at €3 million. Lucien Agume, French midfielder. 23 years old, valued at €8 million. Batista Mendy, French midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €10 million. Djibril Sow, Swiss midfielder. 28 years old, valued at €7 million. Manu Bueno, Spanish midfielder. 21 years old, valued at €2 million. Isaac Romero, Spanish forward. 25 years old, valued at €6 million. Akor Adams, Nigerian forward. 25 years old, valued at €5 million. Alexis Sanchez, Chilean forward. 36 years old, valued at €2 million. Ruben Vargas, Swiss forward. 27 years old, valued at €11 million. Pec Fernandes, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €4 million. Alphon Gonzalez, Spanish forward. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Chidera Ajuk, Nigerian forward. 27 years old, valued at €4 million. Adnan Januzaj, Belgian forward. 30 years old, valued at €1 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Valencia, Squad 2025-26 season. Valencia CF, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at Mestalla Stadium. The total market value of the team is €166 million. The manager is Carlos Corberán. Stole Dmitrievski, North Macedonian goalkeeper. 31 years old, valued at €2 million. Christian Rivero, Spanish goalkeeper. 27 years old, valued at €100,000. Julian Aguirrezabala, Spanish goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €15 million. Jose Capete, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €4 million. Mokhtar Diakhaby, Guinean defender. 28 years old, valued at €3 million. Cesar Tarrega, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €15 million. Thierry Correia, Portuguese defender. 26 years old, valued at €3 million. Jose Gaya, Spanish defender. 30 years old, valued at €6 million. Dimitri Falquer, French defender. 32 years old, valued at €1 million. Jesus Vazquez, Spanish defender. 22 years old, valued at €3 million. Aray Kumet, Swiss defender. 27 years old, valued at €2 million. Javi Guerra, Spanish midfielder. 22 years old, valued at €25 million. André Almeida, Portuguese midfielder. 25 years old, valued at €10 million. Lucas Beltran, Argentine midfielder. 24 years old, valued at €10 million. Pepelu, Spanish midfielder. 27 years old, valued at €7 million. Baptiste Santamaria, French midfielder. 30 years old, valued at €5 million. Filip Ugrinic, Swiss midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €7 million. Arnaf Danjuma, Dutch forward. 28 years old, valued at €4 million. Hugo Duro, Spanish forward. 25 years old, valued at €16 million. Luis Rioja, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at €2 million. Diego Lopez, Spanish forward. 23 years old, valued at €15 million. Lagi Ramazani, Belgian forward. 24 years old, valued at €8 million. Dani Rabah, Spanish forward. 29 years old, valued at €3 million. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content. Villarreal, squad 2025-26 season. Villarreal CF, from Spain. Competing in La Liga, they play at La Ceramica Stadium. The total market value of the team is €280 million. The manager is Marcelino Luis Jr., Brazilian goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €10 million. Diego Conde, Spanish goalkeeper. 26 years old, valued at €5 million. Arnau Tenas, Spanish goalkeeper. 24 years old, valued at €4 million. Logan Costa, Cape Verdean defender. 24 years old, valued at €18 million. Adria Altamira, Spanish defender. 24 years old, valued at €2 million. Rafa Marin, Spanish defender. 23 years old, valued at €10 million. Willy Camboire, French defender. 21 years old, valued at €4 million. Juan Foyth, Argentine defender. 27 years old, valued at €15 million. Renato Veiga, Portuguese defender. 22 years old, valued at €25 million. Santiago Moreno, Uruguayan defender. 23 years old, valued at €10 million. Sergi Cardona, Spanish defender. 26 years old, valued at €10 million. Alfonso Pedraza, Spanish defender. 29 years old, valued at €2 million. Pau Navarro, Spanish defender. 20 years old, valued at €3 million. Dani Parejo, Spanish midfielder. 36 years old, valued at €1 million. Santi Comasana, Spanish midfielder. 29 years old, valued at €8 million. Thomas Partey, Ghanaian midfielder. 32 years old, valued at €8 million. Pape Gay, Senegalese midfielder. 26 years old, valued at €25 million. Mana Solomon, Israeli forward. 26 years old, valued at €14 million. Gerard Moreno, Spanish forward. 33 years old, valued at €3 million. Georges Mikautadze, Georgian forward. 24 years old, valued at €30 million. Ilyas Akomek, Moroccan forward. 21 years old, valued at €15 million. Tajon Buchanan, Canadian forward. 26 years old, valued at €9 million. Nicolas Pepe, Ivorian forward. 30 years old, valued at €8 million. Alberto Molero, Spanish forward. 22 years old, valued at €25 million. Tani Oluwaseyi, Canadian forward. 25 years old, valued at €8 million. Jose Perez, Spanish forward. 32 years old, valued at €8 million. Pau Cabans, Spanish forward. 20 years old, valued at €800,000. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more football content.